And we're back, and we're talking about whether the Durst tape is admissible in court here. And I got a bunch of other questions about the case. And you've heard the arguments from the two esteemed barristers to my left here. Now let's go to the verdict as we go to the control room. And what is the jury decision in there? I think we're getting suspense here.
Hung.
Not admissible.
0 for 2?
Oh, I tell you, Doug, I thought you had it this time. I think maybe Jimmy maybe got a hold of somebody in the jury pool in there.
I'll see you guys
Wow. Mayo, I don't know about that one, right? All right. Okay, now let's talk about a couple other questions that I had relating to the case itself here. And talking about how some of these leads have to be getting cold. Take a look at this timeline. Kathleen Durst went missing in '82. And the other people were killed at least a decade ago that you'll see on your screen here. Now, I want to ask about the challenges that this creates for prosecutors. Mayo, how hard is it? I mean, we're talking about some of the dates here, you know, before DNA was such a staple in investigations. How hard does it become when you try and, you know, prosecute a case 30 plus years old?
Generally, the older the case is, the more difficult the case is to prosecute. Although, in a case like this, I think the biggest mistake Mr. Durst made was participating in this documentary in the first place, because what happens is you allow other potential witnesses to see what's been said, and it lets them realize that maybe they have that missing piece to the puzzle. So it would be, I think, extremely unlikely that you would prosecute just based on this television show itself. And even the letter itself, probably, although it gives you circumstantial evidence, you still would need some additional corroboration, and you want to go in with the strongest case you may have. But they may have developed new leads in the interim. There may be other witnesses who are able to provide those missing pieces.
Clients who just can't stay away from the camera. That's got to be some of the biggest nightmares as an attorney, right?
There's no question, and we were talking about it before, you know, the character in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. People are inclined, they want to talk, whether it's to try to exonerate themselves and get themselves out of a mess they're not even in yet. They create it. And that's, I mean, he just thought he had it on him.
Do you sometimes feel like you got to almost beat the clock when you get a client in there in custody? You got to get there as quick as they can because they can't stop themselves from opening their mouths.
We'll all tell you. We make phone calls to the precinct immediately to advise the officer, and then you hope you have an honest officer who will acknowledge your phone call that the man is represented. Don't talk to him. Absolutely.
You almost have to make a notation,
Absolutely.
even that I spoke with this detective at this time, and that, you know,
call from a
attorney-client
phone that you can show it's the number. Yeah.
You know, Rich, in a case like this, it's interesting because there's this HBO documentary that's out that everybody's seen, and if they haven't seen it, they're going to see it now. If anybody else comes forward after this and claims to have relevant information, you know, statements, things like that, the perfect cross-examination is going to be, you heard it on HBO.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Interesting.
After 30 years.
You know, Doug, there's a debate about the timeline a little bit. What HBO apparently, a couple of years ago, did the interview that people have seen in Jinx. By the way, really compelling show if they haven't seen it. They claim when they're going through the raw tape, they only discovered this admission, if we're going to call it that, about 9 months ago, and then they turned it over to the cops. Is there a standard rule as to how much a media company, what responsibility they have, first and foremost, to law enforcement, rather than just having, let's say they didn't turn it over to the cops, and let's say, wow, we got some compelling video, we're going to air this as an exclusive right on the air. Does law enforcement, could they argue, hey, you find anything that's relevant to the commission of a crime, you have to, by law, turn it over to us first and foremost?
Well, you're talking about mandatory reporting, special relationships, things like that. I don't see how a media company has any mandatory reporting rule or a special relationship with law enforcement. I don't think they have to turn over anything they don't want to turn over.
But that goes to my argument that we made during the debate. I mean, there was a relationship here. There was a relationship here from the inception of this documentary, from the research, from the conducting of it, agreements to turn stuff over. They were working together. Whether it rises to the level of agency is a different story, but they almost created the obligation.
Except there's a contractual relationship between HBO and Mr. Durst. The other thing is that there's nothing that would compel them to hand over that information to the police, but there's nothing that prevents them from doing so unless it's contractually stated.
Now, one thing people also may have caught from this documentary was it also has to do with physical evidence, specifically handwriting. Now, the comparison of an anonymous letter sent to Beverly Hills Police to Durst's handwriting was a major turning point, at least if you go by the documentary, and it led to Durst's apparent confession when he saw those letters. Now, Mayo, can handwriting analysis be used to prosecute him? And also, with the advance of technology right now, with what people can print out and stuff like that, you've been on both sides of this. How much can people put two letters and say, oh, same guy?
It's going to be a battle of the experts, and basically handwriting analysis is a powerful tool, but it's not perfect. And we're learning now that even fingerprints are not perfect, and the certainty is much less than we had been led to believe in previous decades. So the reality is that there's a good chance that Mr. Durst is going to have the best experts. And those experts are going to be able to say, well, lots of people write in block print like that, and it's not necessarily Mr. Durst. They're probably even going to be able to go out there and tell you what percentage of people misspell Beverly. And it's going to be a surprisingly larger number of people than you would think.
In terms of standards, people do voice comparisons, right? Is it enough that if you're looking at the jury and they're not along with you, is that really the only threshold that matters here? Or from an admissibility standpoint as to whether or not this is compelling, is there, black letter law here that says yes or no, that is or isn't acceptable? I guess the same thing was decided as it relates to polygraph tests, right?
You know something? Here's the problem. With handwriting analyses, the jury instruction is you've heard from the experts and you can consider them, but ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have to look at these things and make your own determination, and that could be his biggest problem, because you look at those two writings as a layperson, and
first of all, it's crazy writing with the block lettering and the whole thing.
But there are similarities in the L's, the way the top of the B, you look at it as a layperson, and judge tells you, irrespective of what the expert tells you, look at it, and that could be a problem with these writings.
Well, you have to wonder, though, if you know you've committed this crime, why would you write it in your actual handwriting? Why wouldn't you go to lowercase? The other thing is that I always have an issue. Well, that's a good point.
Series,
But you always have to wonder also, when you ask a jury to listen to two experts, and that jury doesn't have any expertise in that area themselves, it becomes a popularity contest, essentially, and then you start to also give more weight based upon whether you saw the documentary or other extrinsic evidence. And the letters themselves ultimately, are not given weight based upon their individual merit.
I've always thought, though, Doug, there's always one person on that jury that loves to believe in conspiracy things. And the more that you enter this in as part of the evidence, whether it's handwriting, it's like the gloves with OJ, right? That somebody's looking for something, just to be, a pain in the you-know-what. Does this almost confuse things, because that's now the standard, that if they believe the letter could have been altered, or if they believe the tape was doctored, or if they believe whatever, that in many ways this helps the defense because people can be focusing on that instead of maybe some of the empirical evidence?
Jury selection. You're talking about jury selection. You got to get the right jury. But what Jim was saying is true. At the end of the day, I've actually had a case as a prosecutor with handwriting. And what I was arguing the whole time, what the defense attorney was arguing the whole time, at the end of the day, the jurors were looking at completely different letters that they were focusing on. So it's a great piece of evidence, because at the end of the day, it's your common sense. You can actually look at the handwriting and make your own decision.
You still do have the issue of chain of custody. You have to be able to establish, for these letters even to be admissible, that it wasn't altered. And that's where your timeline is very important, because where were these things over the past, how many years has it been? So that's one thing. And even with respect to the tape itself,
did anybody doctor it?
Was that doctored? Is that exactly what was said? Is it in context? Is anything missing there? Has the file been altered? All of that's going to come up.
Oh, I would love. I like the tape.
Yeah. All right. When we come back, we're going to get away from the Durst case, and we're going to get to another clip that I'm sure many of you have already seen. And we go to the University of Oklahoma, as well as a couple other college campuses. But the University of Oklahoma president now investigating those racist chants that a fraternity made during a bus trip. Every member of that fraternity has already been punished. The frat house shut down, and just about everybody agrees what they said wasn't just wrong, but was just completely offensive. But we're going to ask our legal panel whether it is, even though ugly, legally protected by the First Amendment.